I just realized I wasn't recording, so we just read verses 17 through 19. Now we're going to talk about them a little bit. So the first part of in verse 17, we've got a quote from the Psalms. The stone which the builder rejected is the same as become the head of the corner. Now, sometimes people, I think even some translations give you the impression that this is like the capstone in an arch, but the head of a corner is like the cornerstone. So you've got two walls that are both putting their weight on one stone. And the fathers say this represents the Old and the New Testament being joined in this one cornerstone, which is Christ. And of course, the fact that he was rejected, but he becomes the head of the corner, is because the religious leaders rejected him, but he nevertheless triumphs. And then he says, whosoever shall fall upon the stone shall be broken, but on whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind into powder. So what Blessed Theophylact says that means is he says that the Jews that rejected Christ were like, I mean, they're spiritually, they fell upon the stone and were broken. But then the stone fell on them in AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed. So that was God's punishment that was on them. There's a Jewish proverb that says something like, a pot falls on a rock or a stone, alas for the pot. The stone falls on the pot, alas for the pot. So either way, the pot gets broken. But in this case, because they rejected Christ, their faith was destroyed, or they spiritually became dead, and then because they didn't repent, they later were literally destroyed. And then it says, the chief priests and the scribes the same hour sought to lay hands on him, and they feared the people, for they perceived that he had spoken this parable against them. So they knew exactly what he was talking about. Any questions about that section before we move on to the next section?
This quote here, the stone which the builders rejected, that's kind of like a universal principle, isn't it, about how the Lord deals with people, like Joseph, the 12, and even King David, how he was the youngest of the brethren, kind of rejected of them. Is that kind of?
It's a pattern you find throughout Scripture where God takes the things that people don't think are the most likely to succeed, and then he does something with them. Right? Yeah. So
I never thought about it like that before.
Yeah, Jacob and Esau, Jacob was the younger of the two twins, and he's the one that winds up getting the promise. So you have this constant theme of the least likely person winding up becoming the person that becomes the most important.
Just real quick, also, I don't know if it means anything or is there any symbolism with it. When you start building, and like a stone building, you always start with the cornerstone. It's always the first thing you lay.
Right. So, okay, let me see how far this section goes here. Okay, let me get somebody to read verses 20 through 26.
So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be righteous, that they might seize on his words, in order to deliver him to the power and the authority of the governor. Then they asked him, saying, Teacher, we know that you say and teach rightly, and you do not show personal favoritism, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, Why do you test me? Did you want me to read?
All the way to verse 26.
Show me a denarius. Whose image and inscription does it have? They answered and said, Caesar's. And he said to them, Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. But they could not catch him in his words in the presence of the people, and they marveled at his answer and kept silent.
Okay, so the beginning of this section lays out exactly what their intentions were, because it says they were seeking that they might take hold of his words, that they might deliver him under the power and authority of the governor, because the Jews didn't have the power to execute anybody in Judea, because it was under the control of the Romans. So it was only by Roman authority that they could do that. And what they were hoping was that one of two things was going to happen. Either Christ was going to say, go ahead and pay taxes to Caesar. And then they could say, well, look, he's a Roman collaborator. And then they could hopefully get the people to turn against him. But if he said, don't pay taxes, then they were going to go to the Roman governor and say, here, this guy's an insurrectionist. He's saying, don't pay taxes. So Christ sees what they're up to. And so he says, show me a penny or a denarius, whose image and superscription is it? It's got Caesar on it. Well, the Jews really didn't like these coins because they had an image of Caesar on one side and often the image of a pagan deity on the other side. And but they nevertheless kept those coins because they were valuable. So the fact that they even had one of these coins on them in the temple, when you ask them to produce one, is somewhat telling, because you literally, one of the reasons why they had money changers in the temple was you were supposed to change your money, whatever pagan money you had, change it, and then they would give you temple shekels that didn't have these things on there. But these people are in the temple and they've still got their pagan coins on there. So then he says this thing, render therefore unto Caesar the things that be Caesar, things that are God's, and they didn't expect an answer quite like that. They didn't really have anything they could say to it. Now, another thing that's interesting here is the fact that these people are pretending to be friendly to him, and so they say, we know that you teach rightly and you don't accept any person. You basically, you're courageous, you're a great teacher, you teach the way of God truly. So they're trying to puff him up, and they're hoping that he's going to then give some kind of a hard saying, like, yeah, we're not going to pay any taxes to those dirty Romans or whatever. And Christ caught him totally off guard with this answer. Now, one of the applications that the fathers make about this is they say, well, they talk about how, we have certain obligations to the government that we're under. And it doesn't matter whether we like the government or not, as long as they're operating within their lawful boundaries, we have to abide by it. So if the government says, okay, well, you need to pay taxes, that's within their bounds of authority. So we're supposed to do that. If they say, that certain things are illegal and that certain things are legal, and these things are not inherently evil, or they're not telling us that we can't do something that we're obligated to do as Christians, then we're supposed to strive to abide by the laws that are imposed upon us. But the thing is, when the government asks us to render unto Caesar the things that are God's, that's when we say no. And we have every right to say no. Not only do we have a right to say no, we have an obligation to say no. And so, for example, in recent memory, we had the whole lockdown thing. And basically in many places, people were being told they couldn't go to church at all. Well, that's the government overstepping its bounds of authority. And it didn't have the right to tell people those things. And so we weren't under no obligation to abide by those kinds of restrictions. But another application the fathers give is, if you think about it spiritually, there are the things of this world that are evil, and then there are the things, the spiritual things, and instead of rendering those things to the devil in the sense of doing them or complying with them, what we're supposed to do is to get rid of those things, to sort of give them back to the devil in the sense of being done with those things, and to give to God the things that God's telling us to do. Any questions or comments on that before we move on to the next section?
This does remind me. I went to high school with a dude named Cesar, and he really liked the first half of Jesus in school. I still not thinking about that.
The verse was also a libertarian's worst nightmare.
I've actually had some libertarians interpret this verse for me, and the way that they interpret it was, well, nothing belongs to Caesar. I mean, if you really think about it, everything's God. So when he says render therefore to Caesar that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. They just say, well, nothing belongs to Caesar, and that's what Jesus was saying. I've had a
Probably not the
libertarian
sense
tell
that
me that.
Christ intended.
Probably not.
That sounds
but
like
I have
excessive
had
cope.
people say that.
Quick question. So in verse 21, they say, neither acceptest thou the person of any. What does that mean?
Well, that phrase means that you are respecting persons. So in other words, like you might, if you were judging something and you were paying or accepting certain persons, you would be more favorable to someone who was better known or more wealthy or more powerful, and shaft somebody who was someone who was not powerful. So when you're not a respecter of persons, that means that you're being fair.
Okay.
Yeah.
It talks about that in the Old Testament, like in the Mosaic Law, right?
Yeah. It's interesting in the Mosaic Law, it says you're not supposed to respect the person who's rich, but you're also not just supposed to favor the poor either, so it flies in the face of the current social justice warrior stuff, which is basically that you should shaft the rich person in favor of the poor. But biblical justice is no, you actually put them all on the same scale, and whoever's right is right, whoever's wrong is wrong. Okay. So now Christ encounters the Sadducees. So the Sadducees were mostly the priests. There were different sects of Judaism. We know about the Pharisees, as we hear about them a lot in the scriptures, and the Sadducees we hear about a little. There were some other sects that we don't hear named in the Gospels, but they also existed. But these were the two big ones. The Pharisees tended to be the rabbis, and they tended to have their basis mostly in the synagogues, whereas the Sadducees were mostly the priests. And so they centered around the temple, but there were priests who were Pharisees, and there might have been some people in synagogues that were Sadducees. There just weren't a lot of them. But the Sadducees seemed to, they denied the resurrection. They denied that there were spirits or that there were angels. And so in some ways, you could say they were kind of like skeptics. They also limited the scriptures to just the 5 books of Moses. So anything that was outside of the 5 books of Moses, they would say, well, that's not Holy Scripture. So that's sort of the background of this encounter. So let me get somebody to read the setup that the Sadducees have to try to catch Christ, because they're trying to disprove the resurrection by making it and what's known as an argumentum ad absurdum, where you basically show how the other person's position leads to an absurdity. So let me get somebody to read verse 27 to 33.
Then came to him certain of the Sadducees, which deny that there is any resurrection, and they asked him, saying, Master, Moses wrote unto us, if any man's brother die, having a wife, and he die without children, that his brother should take his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. There were therefore 7 brethren, and the first took a wife, and died without children. And the second took her to wife, and died childless. And the third took her, and in like manner the 7 also, and they left no children and died. Last of all, the woman died also. Therefore in the resurrection, whose wife of them is she? For 7 had her to wife.
So is everybody familiar with the idea of levirate marriages from the Old Testament? So basically you have this concept of, if you had a childless marriage from a relative that you had an obligation, if you were the next of kin and you were a male and able to marry that woman, to take that wife to yourself and have a child with her, at least would be really considered to be the son of the deceased. And so in this scenario, you've got 7 brethren, and I think the reason why the story has none of them having children is to give Christ out of saying, well, obviously the one that was the actual father of a child would be the one, or something like that. So they have this scenario where you're assuming if you view heaven like the Muslims do, which is this idea of in heaven everyone's still engaged in the same kind of earthly passions as they have on earth, just they're getting a lot more of it, and and you also think that, marriage continues into heaven, and it's in the same form or something similar to it as it is on earth, then you would have this ridiculous situation of this woman who has 7 husbands in heaven. And for a society where if anybody had more than one spouse, it would be the man rather than the woman. To have a woman with 7 spouses would be a ridiculous scenario. So now we have Christ's response. So let me get somebody to read verses 34 to 40.
And Jesus answering said unto them, The children of this world marry and are given in marriage. But they which shall be accounted worthy to obtain that world and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Neither can they die any more, for they are equal unto the angels, and are the children of God, being the children of the resurrection. Now that the dead are raised, even Moses showed at the bush, when he calleth the Lord the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. For he is not a God of the dead, but of the living, for all live unto him. Then certain of the scribes answering said, Master, thou hast well said. And after that they durst not ask him any question at all.
Okay. So one thing that is missing from Luke's account that you find in Matthew's account, maybe in Mark's, I'm not sure, but he begins by saying, you do err not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God. That's one of my favorite quotes, because particularly when you have Protestants talk about how, well, you speak to the dead. The Old Testament says we're not supposed to consult the dead or anything like that. Well, you do err not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God, because God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. That's a great retort for that, because that's the truth. But this begins more getting into the meat of Christ's answer rather than his initial rebuke of them. The children of this world marry and are given in marriage, but they which be accounted worthy to obtain that world and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Now, I've had some people try to say, well, yeah, they don't marry in heaven, but that doesn't mean that your marriage that you already had in earth doesn't continue on in heaven. And the thing is, if that was what Christ was saying, then it really wouldn't be a response to what the Sadducees were saying, because he's talking about the woman who was married to 7 men in this life. So he obviously is saying that there's something different about heaven. Now, he says they are equal unto the angels and are the children of God. So basically, we become like the angels in heaven. And those of you that listen to the Lord of Spirits podcast, they've been talking about this a lot lately, but the whole idea that when 1/3 of the angels fell, that humans are basically created to fill up the ranks of heaven that the demons that fell left. And so does this mean that you don't have any kind of a special relationship with your spouse when you go into heaven? I don't really think that that's what Christ is saying, because St. Paul tells us that we will know even as we are known. And so we will know people in heaven just like we know them in this life, and we'll be reunited. But it's not a fleshly kind of a relationship like you have on earth. So the Muslims are wrong on that one. So you're not going to have less of a relationship with your spouse in heaven because of what Christ is saying. It's going to be a better relationship, because you're going to have intimacy with God and intimacy with each other on a level that you can't even imagine. It just won't be mixed in with earth here.
It just
Also good to hear from Hannah.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
We miss you. It's so nice hearing your voices. Okay, bye.
We miss you too.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't even remember where we were at.
You were answering a question about something from the Deuterocanon.
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that's right. So a lot of times people talk about this as being based on the story of Tobit, and in Tobit you have Tobit's son who winds up marrying a woman who had been married 7 times, and each time her husbands died because some demon was killing them. But that might have been the inspiration for the question, but it's not parallel to that because we don't have any reason to believe that when Tobit's son married her finally that they didn't have children thereafter because they were, God was blessing them. So presumably they did have children.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So let me get somebody to read verses 41 to 47.
And he said to them, how can they say that the Christ is the son of David? Now David himself said in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Therefore David calls him Lord. How is he then his son? Then, in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, beware of the scribes who desire to go around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at feasts, who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation.
Okay, so he basically is posing them a question. This is right after we're told that after that nobody dares ask him any more questions. Now he's asking them a question. How did they say that Christ is David's son, the Messiah? David himself said in the book of the Psalms, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand till I make thine enemies thy footstool. If David's calling him his Lord, how is he his son? Well, he is the son of David, so he's not saying that he's not, but he's basically posing them a question that should make them start thinking, hey, maybe the Messiah is more than just your average descendant of David here. But then we have this where he basically is berating the scribes and talking about their hypocrisy. But if you go to services on Holy Week, the bridegroom matins especially, we have this long reading that's at each one of the bridegroom matins, and the particularly with the Holy Tuesday one is just this long diatribe against the scribes, the Pharisees, and at a certain point I think the lawyers say something like, well, hey, are you attacking us? And he says, well, let me tell you about you, lawyer. And he goes after them too. Yeah. But in the Gospel of Luke, it's much more reduced. So that's what you get is these 2 verses for that long section that you have in the Gospel of Matthew. Any questions about that before we move into chapter 21? But you'll notice, keep in mind, chapter breaks are something that didn't exist in the original text. And so when we have this break, you actually see that what follows in chapter 21 is directly following what he just said about which devour widows' houses and for a show make long prayers, the same shall have greater damnation. So he's talking about their greed, and then the next thing is talking about the widow's mite. So these are not unconnected. This is a continual flow of the text. But any question about what we just read before we move on?
Earlier in the chapter, there were the Sadducees, and I've always wondered, since St. Paul got the Pharisees and the Sadducees arguing, is it that the Sadducees didn't believe in a bodily resurrection, or did they believe that whenever he died, you were done, there was nothing?
They believed that you were done, and basically the only thing you had were descendants. And so they had a very earthly, non-spiritual view of things. And so, which doesn't make any sense when you look at even if you just accept the 5 books of Moses, like Christ said when he rebuked them, when he talks about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what sense would that make if they had ceased to exist? So it doesn't make any sense. Josh, you got a question?
I do have a question about the tax verse. I'm curious, was the American Revolution against the Redcoats, was that a biblical thing to do?
Well, if you want to know my opinion, I would say I don't think it was a particularly biblical thing to have done.
Interesting.
At least not over taxes. Now, the argument that I've heard, which I mean, the best argument I think you could make about the American Revolution is that it wasn't so much a revolution as it was a war to prevent a revolution. Because what was going on is that the British monarchy was acquiring powers to itself that it didn't have in the past. So they were going beyond what sort of had been the agreed deal between the people and the monarchy. And so the revolution was a fight to prevent that from usurping all their freedoms that they believed that they had. But when you think about the tea tax, and you compare that with the taxes that we pay today, I think we owe George the Third of the colony. I think that if we had stayed with George the Third, we might all be a lot better off. You know, now if you look at the United Kingdom today, I wouldn't want to be under the British monarchy today, but it would probably be a very different monarchy if the American Revolution had never happened. And it's certainly true that the American Revolution was promoted by a lot of people who were Masons, and Masons were always anti-monarchy. So that could be part of it too. Hannah, you had a question or comment?
Yes, Father. Actually, I had a question.
Okay.
Kind of piggybacking when we were talking about the Sadducees. Would it be fair to say that, I mean, it's kind of like the concept that we have of heaven. I mean, that didn't become a thing until Christ came into the world, because even the Pharisees that might have believed in the resurrection, I mean, they just knew Hades, correct? So it's like this concept of going to heaven and having relatives to meet in heaven. It's kind of almost exclusive to Christianity, isn't it?
Well, they did believe that there was a bodily resurrection, and they had this concept of Sheol or Hades, but exactly what was going on in Hades, they didn't talk about a lot. And so the idea that prior to the resurrection, people could be with God rather than in Hades is something that the people in the Old Testament didn't anticipate. At least not that I've been able to see. I mean, you have certain things that point in that direction, like the King David in the Psalms often talks about dwelling in the house of the Lord forever and stuff like that. But that could also be interpreted in terms of the resurrection too, and not be interpreted in terms of something that happens while you're waiting for the resurrection. So that would be something that would be different.
I was just thinking it could be a good apologetic, because it's like people are so used to living with Christianity for the past 2,000 years that they don't understand that without Christianity, you don't have that concept of heaven. So it's like, you want to go to heaven and see your parents, you should become Orthodox Christian.
Right.
I have a question too, actually.
Sure.
This one is just kind of clarification of what we're reading. What we just read, the Son of David, Son of God. So that's Jesus asking them this question, right? And then but like, where does he answer the question? Because then it just moves on to talking about the scribes and the poor widow. Like, where's
he doesn't answer the question for them, but the answer that we, as Christians would know would be the correct answer is that he wasn't just the Son of David, he was the Son of God, so he was the God man. And so he's pointing to this mystery of the incarnation that they really didn't have any understanding of, so it's one of these kind of things. Christ often was kind of pointing in the direction of revealing who he was without actually revealing who he was totally. And this was one of those cases.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Dennis.
One quick thing. I know these are Jesus' words. I'm gonna not say an exact because anyway, but he also spoken to the Gentiles of being able to dine at the table with Jacob and Abraham, and so that sense of the Old Testament being still alive and something. I know it's Christianity, him speaking, but he also spoke of them being present at the table of these forebears. So
right,
so to be there.
So prior to the Christ resurrection, the saints of the Old Testament were in Hades, but they were in the what's often referred to as the bosom of Abraham. You know, it was a good place, as opposed to like the rich man in the parable being in the bad place. And they were in the same general place, but they were separated and not experiencing the same things. So at the time of the resurrection, the Gospel of Matthew mentions people seeing saints of old in the city of Jerusalem. And the reason why that happened was this was a way of revealing the fact that that these people were experiencing a change, that, you know, that wasn't just you know, another day. It was these people were being liberated from Hades. Okay, so let me get somebody to read chapter 21, verses 1 through 4.
Then he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, but he saw also a poor widow putting 2 copper coins there. And he said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow put in more than all of them. For all these people put in their gifts to God out of their surplus, while she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on."
So this is right on the heels of talking about these religious leaders that are devouring widows' houses. But here you have a widow who's putting in all the money that she has, which is just a very small amount of money. Often when the word penny is used in the King James, it actually implies a lot more money than we would consider a penny. But in this case, it's pretty close. You know, a mite was a copper coin, very small in size. And so the point being that it's not how much you give, it's how much you're giving out of what you have. So what you have left is another way of looking at it, is also a factor. What are you holding back for yourself versus what are you giving? And God's looking at our sacrificial giving that way. And now, obviously, the temple needed money. I'm sure that the people who ran the temple were always appreciative when some rich person went in there and dropped a big bag of gold coins in there. But if that person just dropped a big bag of gold coins and had a whole lot more, as far as the way God looked at it, it wasn't as big of a deal as it was for someone who was given everything that they had. An allegorical interpretation of this is that this widow she's a widow who her first husband was the Old Testament, and she's coming to Christ, and what she's offering as a pledge of her, for her marriage to Christ is her little faith and a clean conscience, and so that's what we offer to Christ. Any questions about that before we move on? Let me get somebody to read verses 5 through 7.
And as some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said, As for these things which ye behold, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be? And what signs will there be when these things shall come to pass?
So this is another example of how, if you look at other gospels, you get some idea of where these things happen, because this just comes right on the heels of these other things. But in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, it's clear that this is happening later on. And as a matter of fact, they're on the Mount of Olives. I think it's Matthew, but I could be remembering wrong. It might be Mark. But one of those Gospels mentions even who asked the question, because Christ was sitting on the Mount of Olives looking at the city of Jerusalem with these apostles, and they're making these comments. And it was Peter, James, John, and Andrew, and the brother of Peter. So basically, he had 2 pairs of brothers, and they're asking this question. And if you ever get to go to the Holy Land, at some point, you're probably going to go on the Mount of Olives. And we have a convent that you always see in pictures of the Mount of Olives because it's got these beautiful onion domes that are gold. And that's the St. Mary Magdalene convent. And it's very close to the place where traditionally Christ was sitting when he's made these statements. So you can kind of see pretty much the same vantage point as Christ and the apostles had, because the Garden of Gethsemane is like right next to this. And you have a bird's eye view of the whole city. You're the closest thing to you inside the city is like where the temple was, and you can see the entire city from where you're sitting. And so they're just saying, "Hey, Lord, look at these beautiful buildings." You know, that is basically what they're commenting to him. But he's saying, "I'm telling you, there's not going to be one stone left upon another." And unfortunately, we know that was fulfilled. So they're asking, what's going to be the sign of when these things are going to take place? So let me get somebody to read verses 8 through 11.
And he said, Take heed that ye be not deceived, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and time draweth near. Go ye not therefore after them. But when ye shall hear of wars and commotions, be not terrified, for these things must first come to pass, but the end is not by and by. Then he said unto them, Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines, and pestilences, and fearful sights, and great signs shall there be from heaven.
Okay. One point of King James English, the phrase by and by is a phrase you don't hear much anymore. But there was an old Protestant hymn that was, in the sweet by and by, we will meet on that beautiful shore. And I think because of that hymn, partly, people kind of think of by and by as referring to some kind off in the distant future. But by and by actually means soon. So, and even the song, what it's saying is, in the sweet by and by, in the sweet not so far off, we will meet. So that's what that's saying there is that it's not, the end is not yet, or it's not near. So the first thing he's talking about is people, false Christs are rising. And that was something that happened prior to Christ. You had false messiahs that arose, but you certainly had them later on too. And not just a few of them, but matter of fact, after the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, there was another false messiah that was known as Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba literally means the son of a star. That was not his given name. That was basically his pretentious name. And so you had, he was leading the Jews in another war against the Romans. And a lot of the Jews got caught up in this, even very prominent rabbis. And later Judaism looked very negatively on Bar Kokhba because he obviously wasn't really the Messiah. He failed people. But when the Romans crushed that revolt, they then made it a law that there could be no Jews within so many miles of the city of Jerusalem. They were not even going to be able to get close enough to even see where Jerusalem once was. So that was like final nail in the coffin of the Jewish presence in the Holy Land, at least in any great numbers. Although there were always some Jews that remained in the Holy Land, and many of them became Christians. But that's when it ceased to be really a center of Judaism until modern times. And then we have this thing about hearing of wars and commotions or rumors of wars. You hear in another gospel, nations rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom. That's certainly something that we see going on now. But mostly what St. Luke is talking about, what Christ is talking about, is the coming destruction of Jerusalem. But there is this sort of interplay between the end of the age and the destruction of Jerusalem. So some of it's talking about really the end of the age, and some of it's talking about something that happens within the lifetime of the people who are present. And then earthquakes in various places, famines, pestilence. You have famines and pestilence usually because people are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. When people get evil, that's when you start having famines. It's not even so much that God is sending famines as much as it is that people, their evil behavior starts to cause famines to happen. Any questions about that before we look at the next section?
Do you need a cough drop?
I've got cough drops over there. I'll pop one in so you don't have to hear my raspy voice.
Oh, I know.
All right, let's get somebody to read verses 12 through 19.
But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. But it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore, settle it in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your patience possess your souls.
Okay, so so he's talking about the kinds of persecutions. Now, leading up to the time of the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, you had very intense persecutions by non-Christian Jews of Christians, mostly who were Jews. And so you had some of the apostles that were martyred. They were put into prison. They were stoned. But he's telling them that don't think about what you're going to say before you go and are called upon to give a testimony, because God's going to give you the words to speak that your adversaries are not going to be able to gainsay or resist. You just have to trust in God's grace and mercy when you come to that moment. And then you have this thing about being betrayed by both parents, brethren, kinsfolk, and friends. And some of you, they shall be caused to be put to death, and you'll be hated of all men for my sake. But there shall not a hair of your head perish, and your patience possess ye your souls. So when it says, after it says all these things about you being killed, and it says, and not a hair of your head will perish, you might see that as a contradiction. But there's two ways that you could look at that verse, because in the Sermon on the Mount, Christ talks about how, there's not a sparrow that falls without God's knowledge. The very hairs on your head are numbered. You don't know the number of the hairs on your head, but God does. But I think the more likely interpretation, what I saw most of the fathers saying, is that this is talking about how not even one party you will perish in the sense of eternally, that you'll be raised, and then all these things will be restored. So you might lose more than just a hair in terms of your physical life, your death, but in the resurrection you'll be completely restored. And then when it says in your patience possessing your souls, the word patient there is probably the same Greek word that I've seen elsewhere translated patience, that doesn't refer to just sort of waiting things out, but it refers to a sort of an endurance that overcomes. So I think that's what basically is being talked about there, is that when people are persecuting you, if you're bringing that kind of an attitude towards it, to where you're enduring and you're going to overcome because you're not going to give up, then you're going to be able to possess your soul. You're not going to lose your salvation as a result of any of these temptations. Any questions about that before we move on to the next section? Okay, let me get somebody to read verses 20 through 22.
But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that it is desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judah flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of there depart, and let not those who are in the county enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled.
Okay, so so the warning here is that when you see Jerusalem getting surrounded, then you know the desolation is coming. and then you need to flee to the mountains. And this is what the Jews actually did at that. I mean, the Christians did, because they remembered what Christ had commanded them, and that's why they weren't caught up in the destruction. For these are the days of vengeance. Well, this is basically this was the rock falling on the pot, so to speak. And this is the result of the crucifixion of Christ, the punishment that came to the city. And I'm not sure what translation you were using, but when it says they that are in the countries, and let not them that are in the countries enter therein. Let me see, there's a footnote in my translation here. Let's see what it's saying here. Oh, and actually, the footnote says what that means there is not countries like foreign countries, but in the country. So basically, those that are in the areas or the rural areas, they don't need to go to the city; they need to go to the mountains. Let's see. Let me get somebody to read verses 23 and 24.
But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive to all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until times of the Gentiles are fulfilled.
Okay. So, this is obviously presenting a very distressful picture, and if you read the accounts in Eusebius and also in Josephus of what actually happened, you can see why people with children would have been in particular distress. And it's saying that the people in Jerusalem are going to be killed, or they're going to be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem's going to be trodden down by the Gentiles until the times the Gentiles are fulfilled. Let me check the Katina app real quick to see if there's any fathers that say anything about the times of the Gentiles. I'm trying to remember what I read about that.
What app is that?
Katina. It's Catena.
Yeah, that's a cool app that has Patricia commentary.
Yeah, I mean that.
It says verse 24, so here we go.
It's for the cool kids.
There's a distinction. It'll ask you if you want Eastern fathers or Western. Like, so it's Orthodox or Catholic.
Yeah.
I would include all of them
That's
just
awesome.
because you
Just click
sometimes
on-
get some good insights.
Tap on any verse. Tap on any verse and it'll show you commentary by different fathers.
That's pretty cool.
How have I not heard about that?
So
Listen, the evangelicals don't want you to know this. You can have all the fathers' writings. I have all of them on my phone.
Those rotten Bible thumpers, man.
Yeah, and then here, click on name the book. Click from the old one, Old Testament, the New Testament.
Do they have the Apocrypha too?
I don't know if it has the Deuterocanon now.
Yes,
Some of them.
I believe
Some
it
of them.
does.
Yeah.
So
Most of it.
I couldn't find a patristic commentary that gave a direct answer, but they're the Roman Catholic commentator that said the general interpretation is probably drawn upon the fathers as well as maybe some medieval scholars. That basically the times the Gentiles are referring until the gospel is preached to all nations, and then the Jews convert to Christianity and they recognize Christ. So that's what that's referring to, according to them. Any comments about that or questions?
I was watching Jay Dyer's show a while back, and he had mentioned that was referring to the time we're living in, the time of the Gentiles right now until Christ's return. That,
Okay.
for what that's worth, he seems pretty good with that stuff.
That sounds pretty consistent with what I just read, so that's good. You know, there's you can get Blessed Theophylax commentaries on the Gospels in English translations, and they're pretty thorough, but sometimes they're not as detailed as you might wish. And I don't remember him really addressing that in any kind of detail, but maybe I just forgot what I've read, so I could be wrong. But that's something that's worth investing in if you're interested in digging deeper yourself. Let me get somebody to read verse 25 through 28.
And there will be signs in the sun, and the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth, distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near.
And that section seems to be talking about the end times rather than the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's interesting because it comes right on the heels of talking about until the times the Gentiles are fulfilled. So I think that makes sense that this is talking about that aspect of it rather than something that's already happened in the past. Let's see. Because basically, yeah, it ends with the second coming. When you see these things starting to come to pass, look up, lift up your heads, for your redemption draws near. So in other words, when you see these things start to happen, start looking for Christ's return. I think we might be there, but we could be wrong too, because people have been wrong before. But I think that could be it. Now we're at 7:59, so maybe we should pause. We're getting ready to talk about the parable of the fig tree, but we can pick that up next time. Any quick questions before we go? Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and say the closing prayer. It truly means a blessing that bells O bones, seven blessed and most blameless and Father of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God the Word. The very Theotokos to you we magnify. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Father.
We'll be back next week, same bat time, same bat time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Love you guys.
Love you guys.
Fun.
Yeah, just send me a picture.